They thought it was just a farmhouse, a forgotten structure weathered by 200 Ohio winters, rotting quietly in the countryside. But when the new owner broke through a wall of bricks that had stood untouched for 91 years, the air that seeped out was wrong. Thick, metallic, as if the stones themselves had been trying to trap something inside. Behind those bricks wasn't just an old root cellar. It was a chamber that had been sealed for nearly a century, because what happened there was never meant to be found. The basement of the Holloway farm had been more than stone walls and storage. It was a theater of experiments, a hidden hospital, a charnel house for the dying, and the powerful had spent generations ensuring its memory stayed buried. Now, imagine this: a doctor with credentials, a town in terror from an epidemic, and a farm family desperate for money. That's the perfect setup for something darker than death itself, because behind those bricks, men didn't just die of disease. They were sacrificed on the altar of science, wealth, and control. Tonight, you're not just hearing a story. You're uncovering what Ohio's soil tried to hide. The summer of 1832 was a season of fear. Cholera crept silently up the Ohio River, a phantom that turned skin blue and bodies into husks within hours. To the terrified settlers of Marietta, death seemed to stalk every street, every well, every handshake. Into this panic walked Dr. Amos Fletcher, a tall, gaunt figure with eyes that cut through men like glass. His credentials from Philadelphia shone brighter than any lantern in that frontier town. People called him the man who could save us. But Fletcher had not come west to heal. He had come to continue experiments that respectable medicine had already rejected. When he approached Marcus Holloway, offering gold for the use of his cool limestone basement, the farmer thought he was making a simple deal. $50 a month. More money than his land yielded in an entire season. A desperate farmer, a grieving town, and a doctor with theories darker than the disease itself. This was the formula, and in that basement, beneath the laughter of children upstairs, beneath the ordinary creak of floorboards, a different rhythm began to echo, the sound of blood draining into bowls, the silence of the dying, and the secret that would stay bricked off for 91 years. The first patient arrived on August the 15th, Elizabeth Whitman, just 22, with eyes still bright despite the pain twisting her body. Her father, a wealthy merchant, paid Fletcher $25, nearly a year's wages for a common man, for what he believed was advanced medical care. Fletcher promised results. He promised that isolation in the Holloway basement meant survival. What the father didn't know was that Fletcher's treatments were not meant to heal, they were meant to test. That very night, Elizabeth was bled until her lips turned pale, and her breath came in gasps. Mercury compounds were forced down her throat until her body convulsed. And then, silence. She was dead before dawn. Her father told only that the disease progressed too swiftly. She was buried quickly, as Fletcher insisted, in the soil behind the farmhouse. No questions asked, no witnesses. The basement became a stage for a ritual that repeated itself again and again. Families arrived with hope. They left with funerals. And Fletcher, he left with money, organs preserved in jars, and notes in his leather journal, where each death was not a tragedy, but a successful experiment. To him, cholera was never the enemy. Ignorance was the weapon. By September, word had spread across Washington County. Dr. Fletcher's private hospital was the best chance of survival. Families sold land, borrowed money, and handed him their loved ones in exchange for hope. They did not realize they were paying to bury them. Every patient who entered the Holloway basement died, not from cholera, but from Fletcher's so-called graduated depletion therapy. He drained them of quarts of blood, dosed them with mercury until their skin blistered, then wrote in his journal that their humoral balance had been restored moments before they slipped into death. The basement smelled of iron and chemicals, a blend of decay masked by the smoke of oil lamps. Fletcher was careful. He charged different rates depending on wealth, always making his victims believe they were receiving exclusive, advanced care. To the Holloways, the money felt like salvation, But Sarah Holloway began to notice. Each night, she lay awake as faint groans seeped up through the floorboards. Every morning, she watched Fletcher carry out another stiff body, claiming contagion required quick burial. She whispered to her husband, "It isn't right. Not one soul walks out alive." But Marcus silenced her with the cruel logic of debt. Better their deaths than our ruin. But death alone wasn't enough for Dr. Fletcher. Each patient who perished beneath the farmhouse became more than a corpse. They became currency. After the final breath, Fletcher would lock the basement door, light another lamp, and begin what he called post-mortem examinations. He wasn't just recording symptoms. He was harvesting. Organs removed, hearts floating in jars, livers sliced and preserved in alcohol. To the Holloways, he said it was research, but in truth he had tapped into a lucrative market. Medical schools in Cincinnati and Columbus paid handsomely for fresh human specimens, no questions asked. A shipment of preserved tissue could fetch more than a farmer's yearly income. Fletcher kept meticulous ledgers. Each entry was cold, calculated. Specimens from male age 45, excellent condition. Profit $37 after burial expenses. Imagine that, human life reduced to margins in a ledger. To the families above, Fletcher wore the mask of solemn respect, speaking of God's will and the ravages of disease. But underground, among his jars and scalpels, he was a merchant of the dead. The basement was no longer a hospital, it was a slaughterhouse disguised as science, and every brick of that wall, sealed decades later, was mortared with the silence of the guilty. By November, Fletcher's system was running with grotesque efficiency. A steady flow of patients arrived through a side entrance Marcus had built, ostensibly to maintain quarantine, but in truth to keep eyes away from what was happening below. The Holloways had grown accustomed to the routine. A wagon would arrive, carrying a desperate family and their trembling loved one. Money exchanged hands. Then the family was told they could not visit for several days. Disease protocol, Fletcher insisted. By the time they returned, they were met not with a recovering patient, but with news of an untimely passing and a demand for burial fees. Yet Fletcher was clever. He tailored his prices by class. Merchants paid more, farmers less. Everyone believed they were getting privileged care, when in reality they were paying to have their kin bled out and gutted for organs. But Sarah Holloway couldn't ignore the truth much longer. At night, the farmhouse floorboards carried up the sounds of agony, the low moans of those fading under Fletcher's knife. Her instincts screamed that something more than cholera was killing these people, and then came the girl who changed everything, 16-year-old Martha Cunningham, young, strong, too early in her illness to die quickly. Martha Cunningham was unlike Fletcher's other patients. She was young, stubborn, and though fever burned her skin, her eyes still carried defiance. Her father, a blacksmith with roughened hands, had scraped together nearly everything he owned to bring her to Holloway Farm. He begged Fletcher to save her, swearing he would pay more once business recovered. Fletcher accepted without hesitation. Youthful bodies fetched higher demand on the medical market, but Sarah Holloway noticed something different. When Martha was lowered into the basement, she did not cry in weakness. She screamed. The sound rattled through the farmhouse like a blade dragged over stone. Sarah confronted Fletcher, demanding to know why the girl was still lucid if she was supposedly on the edge of death. Fletcher's reply was chilling. Youth resists the cure. Stronger veins require deeper depletion. That night, Sarah pressed her ear to the floorboards. She heard struggling, furniture scraping, a muffled cry that was not fading, but growing more desperate, and for the first time Sarah saw through Fletcher's veil of authority. This was not medicine. This was ritualized killing. The girl's screams were proof, and if Martha survived long enough to be heard by others, the wall of silence would begin to crack. The next morning, the Cunningham family returned with food and blankets, hoping to comfort Martha. Fletcher barred the door, insisting her condition was too volatile for visitors. But as they pleaded outside, a faint cry echoed through the farmhouse walls, a cry unmistakably belonging to their daughter. The father's face went pale. "She's still fighting," he whispered. Fletcher quickly drowned the noise by dragging a chair across the basement floor, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Word spread in the village tavern that night. Men whispered that the Holloway farm was not a hospital, but a place of disappearing screams. Sarah Holloway, torn between her husband's debts and her conscience, began leaving scraps of food and water near the basement stairs when Fletcher wasn't watching, praying the girl might cling to life, but she also knew each act of kindness risked Fletcher's wrath. The doctor kept his journal close, pages filled with meticulous sketches of organs, diagrams of veins, and financial notations beside each name. Sarah glimpsed one entry. Cunningham specimen, excellent vascularity, delay in termination risks exposure. Her blood froze. Fletcher no longer spoke of patients, he spoke of specimens, and Martha Cunningham was next to vanish. By the third night, Martha's strength had become Fletcher's problem. Most victims bled into weakness within hours, but she fought, clung, resisted. Sarah heard it all, the rattling chains Fletcher used to pin her to the table, the muffled sobs breaking into screams, and Fletcher's voice muttering, half medical, half ritual, about yielding the body to science. Her cries carried beyond the farmhouse. Neighbors passing on the dirt road paused, listening, uneasy. One boy swore he heard her shouting her own name, as though to remind the world she was still alive. Fletcher grew paranoid. He ordered Marcus Holloway to double-seal the basement doors, to pile barrels against the walls, to ensure no sound could betray them. But the louder Fletcher tried to silence her, the stronger suspicion grew. Sarah's dread transformed into quiet rebellion. She smuggled a slip of paper down to Martha, scrawled with a single line, "Hold on, someone will hear you." That note became a weapon more powerful than chains. For the first time, Martha realized she was not alone, and Fletcher realized his carefully crafted illusion of control was unraveling. The screams were no longer confined to the basement. They were seeping into the consciousness of an entire county. It began with knocks at the door. A neighbor, polite but uneasy, asking if Fletcher required assistance. A passing minister, offering prayers, unsettled by the smell of chemicals leaking through the floorboards. Each time, Marcus Holloway intercepted them, spinning tales of progress, of patients resting in silence, of the unpleasant odors of sickness being purified with lime. But rumors were louder than excuses. In taverns and market squares, whispers became accusations. Too many burials, too quickly, too secretly. Families began refusing to send their sick to Fletcher, claiming they would rather face death at home than vanish behind the Holloway walls. Fletcher responded with calculated charm, hosting a staged visitation where 2 patients groaned theatrically beneath blankets, hired vagrants, bribed with liquor and coin. The performance calmed some, but not all. The Cunningham family was not deceived. They had heard their daughter's voice, and now they rallied neighbors to demand proof she lived. One night, a small group approached the farmhouse with lanterns, pounding on the door until Marcus appeared, pistol in hand, insisting all was well. But behind him, faint and desperate, came a sound no lie could cover. Martha's scream, raw and undeniable. The crowd froze. The secret was bleeding out. The scream at the doorway shattered Fletcher's fragile facade. For years he had balanced death and secrecy with precision, but Martha's voice had tipped the scales. That night, after the crowd dispersed reluctantly, Fletcher turned on the Holloways. His eyes burned with fury as he hissed, "If she speaks again, all of us hang." Marcus, trembling but loyal to his debts, nodded. Sarah, pale and silent, felt her stomach twist. Fletcher descended into the basement with his surgical kit, his boots echoing like a death knell on the stone steps. Martha lay strapped to the table. He knew, her wrists raw from fighting, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. Fletcher whispered to her, not like a doctor, but like a butcher, "Your voice has cost too much. Tonight, it ends." But as he raised the scalpel, Martha did something no one expected. She sang, a hymn her mother had taught her, broken and ragged but defiant, rising up through the floorboards. The Holloways froze. The farmhouse walls seemed to vibrate with her fragile melody. Sarah's hand trembled on the doorknob, torn between obedience and salvation. Fletcher's face contorted, not with science, but with rage. The girl was no longer a patient. She was a witness, and witnesses had to be destroyed. Sarah Holloway had endured months of muffled groans and silent burials, convincing herself it was for survival. But Martha's hymn pierced deeper than debt or fear. It was not the sound of a dying girl, it was the sound of truth clawing its way to the surface. As Fletcher raised his scalpel to carve silence into her throat, Sarah burst through the basement door. The lantern flame cast monstrous shadows against the stone walls, jars filled with organs, rows of bones, and Fletcher looming like a demon over the bound girl. "Enough!" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling but sharp. Fletcher wheeled on her, eyes wild. "Do you understand what you're risking? They'll destroy us all if she speaks." Sarah's gaze swept the horror surrounding her. "She's already speaking, and so am I." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by Martha's shallow breathing. Marcus appeared at the doorway, torn between his wife and his master. Fletcher thrust the scalpel into Marcus's hand, snarling, "Choose your debts or your soul." Marcus's knuckles whitened around the blade, his face grey with terror. And in that instant, Sarah realized the wall of silence had never been built from stone. It was built from cowardice, and it was begged, inning to crack. Marcus Holloway had always believed he could live with the weight of silence. He told himself the money justified the bodies, that debt was a harsher master than conscience. But standing in that basement, Fletcher's scalpel trembling in his hand, Marcus saw the lie collapse. The stone walls reeked of iron and rot. The shelves lined with jars stared back at him like glass eyes, each one a ledger of his complicity. Martha coughed, her voice a rasp but still alive, still begging without words. Sarah's eyes locked onto his, pleading, daring him to finally act like a man, not a coward. Fletcher barked, "Do it! End her voice or I'll end yours." For a heartbeat, Marcus felt the old grip of fear. His hand hovered above the girl's chest, but then Martha whispered a single word. "Please." It wasn't a demand. It was a reminder that she was human, not a specimen. Marcus dropped the scalpel. The clang of steel on stone echoed like a verdict. Fletcher roared, lunging for the blade, but Marcus shoved him back. Sarah rushed to untie Martha's bindings, her hands trembling. In that instant, the balance shifted. Fletcher no longer commanded silence. The silence was breaking. The sound of the scalpel hitting stone carried farther than the basement. Outside, neighbors had gathered again, lanterns in hand, drawn by the hymn and the commotion. Their shadows loomed through the farmhouse windows as Fletcher realized control was slipping from his grasp. He lunged at Marcus, blade in hand, spitting curses that blended medicine with madness. "You fools! Disease demands sacrifice. Science demands silence." Marcus grappled with him, their struggle crashing against shelves of jars that shattered, spilling alcohol-soaked organs across the floor. The stench of death surged upward, seeping through the cracks, undeniable now. Sarah dragged Martha toward the stairs, her voice raw as she screamed for help. And help answered. The front door splintered under the force of boots. Farmers, townsfolk, and the Cunningham family stormed inside with lanterns and shotguns, their eyes wide at the horror spilling out before them. Fletcher staggered up from the wreckage, his white coat smeared red, shrieking that they were destroying progress. But no one believed him anymore. The basement was no longer hidden. The wall of secrecy was gone. And for the first time, the true weight of Fletcher's sins lay exposed, not in whispers, but in firelight and furious eyes. The townsfolk stood frozen at first, their lanterns trembling as the truth revealed itself. Jars of organs, rows of bones, the stench of rot layered with chemicals. Mothers clutched their mouths in horror. Fathers gripped their shotguns tighter, rage flooding where doubt once lived. Fletcher raised his blood-stained hands, as if to command authority one last time. "You simpletons," he spat, his voice breaking. "You worship ignorance. I have touched the very essence of life. These bodies, your loved ones, were not wasted. They served knowledge greater than you. His words ignited the crowd's fury instead of quelling it. Martha, weak but alive, was lifted by her father, her voice breaking as she whispered, "He kills." That single word broke the final thread of restraint. The blacksmith swung first, striking Fletcher across the jaw with the iron weight of his hammer. Others surged forward, dragging him to the farmhouse floor. His screams echoed, not as a doctor, but as a cornered animal. Sarah Holloway turned away, clutching Martha, tears streaming, not in grief for Fletcher, but in relief that the truth was no longer hers alone to bear. In the chaos, Fletcher's empire of silence was torn apart. The man who built walls of secrecy was now buried beneath the roar of vengeance. In the days that followed, the Holloway farmhouse became a place of whispered legends. The townsfolk buried Fletcher in a shallow grave near the river, a crude memorial to the man who had turned science into slaughter. Marcus and Sarah Holloway survived, but their lives were fractured. The basement was bricked off, sealed behind stone walls that held its horrors for 91 years, a silent testament to greed, fear, and complicity. Martha Cunningham recovered, but the memory of screams, the smell of iron, the rows of preserved organs stayed with her for life, a shadow that no hymn could entirely lift. And yet, the Holloways understood the power of secrecy. Some truths, once unearthed, demand vigilance. The farmhouse stood abandoned for decades, its fields growing wild, the walls guarding the echoes of terror within. When finally, a man in the 20th century bought the property and discovered the bricked-off basement, historians would marvel, but few could grasp the human darkness it had contained. Money, desperation, ambition, and fear had converged there, leaving a legacy that would challenge anyone who dared to understand it. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some secrets, once heard, change the listener forever.